In the cold heart of the Trivex Nebula, where stars burned a deep violet and space shimmered with ancient energy, Empress Velzinth of the Excellanti Dominion stood before her throne of living stone, her three eyes scanning the holographic star map projected before her. The map pulsed with life, showing the millions of systems under her rule, each marked in glowing gold, a reminder of the reach and power of the Dominion. For over 9 centuries, her empire had expanded unchecked, absorbing civilizations through awe, power, and the terror of her psionic war beasts, massive organic ships, grown over generations, linked to her mind by threads of thought and dominance. But now, something had changed. A red flare blinked on the edge of the map, far beyond the surveyed borders, in a sector so empty and quiet it was once labeled the Silent Spiral. The name had suited it for centuries: no signals, no movement, nothing but cold stars and lifeless planets. Until now. The Empress had received a report from the forward scouts only hours ago. A fleet of 6 Excellanti dreadbeasts, fully armed and psionically linked, had entered the Silent Spiral to investigate a growing field of artificial signals, strange radio bursts, narrowband laser pulses, encrypted tight beam transmissions, all far too organized to be natural. The scouts never returned. There was no battle broadcast, no distress signal, no dying scream through the psionic link. Just silence. Complete, total silence. Not even death echoed back. That silence was more terrifying than any scream. The Empress, whose mind could crush a planet's will in minutes, found herself unsettled. This had never happened before. Not during the War of the 8 Suns. Not even against the silent choir of Krovax. In all her reign, no enemy had ever erased her ships without a trace. And so she summoned her war council. Tall, elegant figures dressed in bone-like armor lined up beneath the vast dome of the palace, each connected to their own fleets, minds sharp and full of questions. High Mind Lord XF spoke first, his voice echoing with power. Your Radiance, we believe the source is artificial, possibly sentient. Perhaps remnants of the old precursor network. Others disagreed, suggesting rogue AI constructs or ancient planetary defense systems reawakened. But none could explain how 6 dreadbeasts, each as large as a moon and protected by psionic armor, could vanish without a whisper. One advisor finally mentioned the word most feared in the chamber: unknown. The Empress narrowed her eyes. Unknown meant uncontrollable. Unknown meant unpredictable. And that could not be allowed. With a flick of her clawed hand, she ordered the dispatch of a diplomatic envoy, guarded by 10 warbeasts and 2 psionic probes. Not a war party, not yet, but a show of strength. A signal. This new species, if it was even that, would be made to understand the hierarchy of the galaxy. As the envoy departed, the Empress turned back to her private chamber, the walls pulsing faintly with the heartbeat of her palace, grown from the bones of a dead world. She tried to reach beyond, extending her awareness across the threads of psionic energy that ran through her empire like veins. She felt the dreams of her people, the hunger of her warbeasts, even the soft storms on distant planets, but she could not feel the envoy once it crossed the border into the Silent Spiral. It was as if the space beyond had no threads, no flow, no echo. It was a blank void, dead to her senses. That alone made her blood run cold. For the first time in centuries, the Empress of the Endless Stars did not know what waited for her. Days passed, then weeks. And finally, a signal came not through the psionic network, but through a primitive radio burst, carefully modulated and translated. It played once, then repeated. The message was short: envoy vessel neutralized. No hostilities intended. Return is denied. The Empress watched the message on repeat, the voice speaking perfect Excellanti with machine-like clarity. It was not mocking. It was not afraid. It was simply calm. She demanded images, sensor data, anything. The wreckage of the envoy ships had been gently placed in orbit around a moon, clearly visible from long-range scanners. No life signs. No psionic damage. No scorch marks. Every ship had been carefully dismantled, cut with surgical precision along energy lines, as if taken apart by someone who wanted to study how they worked. This was not a war act. This was observation, curiosity, as if whoever or whatever was in the silent spiral did not fear the Excellanti but found them interesting. That thought unsettled the Empress more than open hostility ever could. She had faced enemies. She had crushed rebellion, but she had never been studied before. She called for the Grand Historian and demanded a full analysis of the species known to exist in that region before the spiral went silent. The answer was unexpected. Only one species had ever settled near that zone, and they had been insignificant, young, primitive, barely spacefaring a few centuries ago. Their homeworld was labeled Sol 3, called Earth in their own tongue. The species? Humans. The Empress leaned forward, her crown of bone and fire crackling with static. "Bring me everything on them," she commanded. And so the data flowed. Images of Earth cities, rough records from ancient probes, intercepted transmissions filled with music, speeches, and war broadcasts. The humans were passionate, inventive, reckless. And they had vanished from known space nearly 150 years ago, just after developing faster-than-light travel. No one had seen or heard from them since. Most believed they had destroyed themselves. Others thought they had fled into uncharted space. But now it seemed they had been hiding, or preparing, or evolving. The Empress suddenly felt the weight of a new reality pressing against the edge of her mind. Humanity had returned, and not quietly. The silent spiral was no longer silent. It was occupied, and it belonged to them. As the chamber dimmed and the stars outside pulsed with unknown frequencies, Empress Veil Zinth stood in silence, her claws tightening around the edge of her throne. For the first time in living memory, the apex predator of the galaxy felt something close to hesitation. Somewhere out there, in the dark beyond her reach, a force had emerged. A force that could erase her ships without firing a shot. A force that took apart her technology to learn, not to conquer. And above all, a force that spoke in calm tones while returning her most powerful threats in pieces. The humans had not roared. They had whispered. And that whisper had shaken the stars. The stars over Neptune shimmered faintly as the UNS Endeavour, humanity's first diplomatic flagship, held position above the cold blue planet. Its hull was smooth and silver, shaped like a great spear, but beneath that sleek surface pulsed the power of a civilization reborn in silence. Inside, Captain Elora Chen stood tall on the command deck, her eyes fixed on the massive screen displaying a visual of the incoming Excellanti delegation. They had answered humanity's transmission at last, arriving through a tier in space that shimmered like broken glass. Their ships looked alive, breathing, shifting, covered in chitin and bone plating. The central vessel resembled a serpent with 1,000 eyes, its body curled in impossible geometry. It was not a war fleet, but it was clearly no peaceful vessel either. Alara had seen war before on Mars, during the Titan rebellions, but nothing like this. And yet, she stood calm, her uniform crisp, her voice steady. Humanity had spent over a century hidden in the silent spiral, building in secret after the collapse, growing stronger with every decade. They had learned from their past, united their scattered nations, and risen with quiet determination. Now, the galaxy was watching again. As the alien ship stabilized its orbit, a psionic broadcast surged across the system, striking human sensors like a wave of static and pain. But the fleet's dampening fields absorbed most of it, neutralizing the effect. The message that followed was translated instantly by quantum AIs. "We are the Excellanti. The Empress extends a final chance for submission. Your expansion is unauthorized. Your silence, unacceptable." Alara raised an eyebrow and gave a small smile. These beings expected fear, expected retreat. But that was not what humanity had become. She nodded to her comms officer, who opened a secure visual channel. A moment later, the bridge screen changed and the Excellanti appeared. Tall, slender, armored in bone, with eyes that shimmered with stars. Their ambassador stood like a god among insects, surrounded by lesser beings. Alara stepped forward, her voice clear and firm. "I am Captain Elara Chen, envoy of the Unified Terran Command. We acknowledge your message and offer peaceful dialogue, but we do not submit. This region is under Terran jurisdiction. You are welcome as guests, not as rulers." The alien ambassador stared in silence, its gaze sharp enough to pierce metal. Then, it tilted its head slightly, as if confused. "You are young," it replied. "You are small. You cannot hide behind empty threats." Alara didn't blink. Instead, she tapped her command pad. The screen behind her shifted to a live feed from the moon, specifically the Mare Imbrium testing site. A single Terran supercarrier, Titanus Rex, hovered in low orbit. The crowd on the bridge watched as the massive ship adjusted its trajectory and fired a single kinetic rod, just a metal cylinder, no explosives. It struck a marked section of the moon at near relativistic speed, creating a shockwave that shook the lunar dust for hundreds of miles, yet precisely avoided the research outposts nearby. A crater appeared perfectly centered, perfectly controlled. Alara looked back at the ambassador. That was a warning shot. "We don't miss." The alien shifted uneasily, its mouth opening slightly in a sign of confusion or maybe surprise. The psionic energy in the room had faded, as if the Excellanti presence had weakened. But there was more. Alara ordered the main fleet to broadcast their position to the Excellanti just for 10 seconds. In that moment, over 50 supercarriers revealed themselves across the outer solar system. Each one was larger than any traditional warship, powered by quantum fusion cores, equipped with cloaking fields and planetary defense arrays. They had remained hidden until now, waiting for orders. The Excellanti envoy didn't speak this time. It simply stared, perhaps realizing for the first time that this species, these humans, were not the same ones from ancient galactic records. They had disappeared long ago, yes, but not to hide. They had been preparing, studying, advancing in ways the rest of the galaxy hadn't seen or understood. And most disturbing of all, the humans had no psionic signature. They could not be read, could not be sensed, could not be influenced. They were silent minds, blank slates, invisible to the powers the Excellanti used to control lesser species. That made them dangerous. That made them unknowable. Back in her private quarters, Alara reviewed the results with Admiral Ortega, a veteran who had helped design humanity's deep fleet strategies. He looked over the data and smiled. "They didn't expect us to survive, let alone thrive." Alara nodded. "We spent 100 years watching. They never looked this way. Now they have, and they don't know what they found." Ortega leaned back. "That's our advantage. They see us as insects, but we're the storm they never heard coming." Outside, the stars shifted slowly as the Excellanti ship withdrew. There was no reply, no threats, just silence as the alien vessel turned and vanished into subspace. Alara knew it wasn't over. This was only the beginning. But she also knew something the Empress hadn't expected: humanity didn't need to roar to win a war. Sometimes, silence was louder than sound. The silence that followed the Excellanti envoy's retreat was thick, heavy, and unsettling. It hung in the cold expanse of the outer solar system like a dark cloud that threatened to burst at any moment. Empress Velzinth stood on her royal balcony, gazing out over the star-streaked expanse beyond her palace. The stars here were far older than anything humanity had ever known, their light a faint whisper of forgotten times. Yet, even in this ancient place, something had changed. Her mind, always sharp and vast, could not shake the sensation of unease. The humans, the Terrans, had done something unexpected, something that made her power feel distant, fragile. They had not only survived, but thrived. She had known them only as a scattered, primitive species, long lost to history, a footnote in the records of galactic conquest. But now, they had returned, and their quiet, calm manner of approaching their existence had unsettled even her. The fleet of 200 supercarriers revealed to her eyes had not been part of any known record. The humans had kept them hidden for years, perhaps centuries, unknown to the Excellanti Dominion. They had spent a century alone, watching, learning, and now they were ready. The time for diplomacy was over. It was clear that the Excellanti would never let humanity simply be. They would demand submission. They would seek control. And it was now that Empress Veilzinth knew that this was no longer about conquest. It was about survival. Back on Earth, a similar silence had settled. Captain Elara Chen paced the observation deck of the Endeavour, her eyes fixed on the holographic projection of the fleet. The 200 supercarriers now hung in a lattice formation, scattered across Neptune's orbit, a wall of human strength and resolve that could be felt from millions of miles away. Each supercarrier was a city in itself, fully self-sustaining and equipped with everything humanity needed for a long campaign. Some were designed for diplomacy, others for exploration, but all were ready for battle should the need arise. The fleet's primary weapons, kinetic disruptors and quantum torpedoes, lay dormant for now, their potential only hinted at by the quiet hum of the fusion reactors. But there was more beneath the surface. Each ship, every crew member, every officer was connected in a web of information and strategy. Humanity had learned to move as one, a singular, unified force that could not be easily divided. It was not brute force they relied on. They were not like the Excellanti, whose power lay in their psychic abilities and massive war beasts. Humanity had grown beyond the need for such primitive tools. They fought with mind, not muscle. Alara's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Ortega, his face grim. He stepped into the command room, his uniform perfectly crisp, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "Captain, we've received a communication. It's encrypted with Excellanti frequencies." Alara raised an eyebrow, but motioned for him to continue. "It's a warning. A threat, really. They claim that if we do not retreat, they will be forced to destroy us and all our fleet. They've gathered their own forces just outside of Neptune's orbit." The screen flickered and the Excellanti ambassador appeared once again. His features were rigid, expressionless, yet the air around him seemed to crackle with psychic energy. "Humanity," he began, his voice cold, "you have crossed a line. You do not understand the consequences of your defiance. This region belongs to the Excellanti Dominion. Your fleets are a threat to the balance of power in this galaxy. Surrender or be destroyed." The message ended, leaving a silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity. Alara stood still, absorbing the weight of the ambassador's words. There was a subtle shift in the air, the tension thickening. Ortega watched her carefully, knowing that his captain never made decisions without full consideration. Finally, Alara turned to him, her eyes hardening. "Tell the fleet to stand ready. We're not retreating. We're not bowing. It's time they understand who we are." She paced for a moment, her mind racing. The Excellanti believed that humanity was weak, primitive, or just a small nuisance at best. They saw their psionics and massive warships as unbeatable. But the humans had one thing the Excellanti didn't, the element of surprise. The Terrans had fought battles in their own way, quiet and controlled, their tactics designed not just to win, but to outthink their enemies before the first shot was even fired. Across the fleet, the command was sent. The supercarriers began to align, their hulls shifting slightly, as if they were becoming one massive, coordinated entity. The silent hum of their reactors grew louder as the crew inside each ship began their final preparations. Alara knew that the Excellanti had underestimated them. They had no idea what humanity was truly capable of when pushed to the brink. As the fleet aligned, the first of the Excellanti warbeasts, a gargantuan organic ship known as Vothxan, entered the outer edges of the solar system. The sight of it sent a chill down Elara's spine. It was unlike anything the humans had ever seen, massive, twisting, and made of living metal and bone, exuding an aura of raw power and ancient psionics. It was the flagship of the Empress herself. But it would not matter. The Excellanti would soon learn that raw power alone could not guarantee victory. Suddenly, the bridge lights flickered as the fleet's quantum shields began to charge. Alara stood at the center, her face set in determination. It was time to show the Excellanti what humanity had become. "Activate the stealth fields," she ordered. "Initiate Phase 2. Around Neptune, the fleet vanished from sight, not with the typical cloaking technology used by lesser species, but with a perfect, undetectable field that bent light and energy around them. In an instant, the 200 supercarriers were gone. If the Excellanti had sensors capable of detecting their presence, they would have to search for years before finding even the smallest trace. From their hidden positions, the fleet watched as the Vothzan and its accompanying warships moved closer to Neptune. The Excellanti had no idea. Humanity's fleet was waiting. The supercarriers stood silent, poised for the strike. There was no need for an overwhelming assault. Every ship, every drone, every weapon had been prepared for this moment. And when the Excellanti ships crossed into the strike zone, it would be too late. The battle would be swift. It would be decisive. And above all, it would be a warning. Humanity would not kneel. Not now. Not ever. As the first of the Excellanti ships moved closer, the comms officer on the Endeavor called out, "Captain, we've received another transmission from the Empress herself." Alara's eyes narrowed. "Put it through." The screen flickered, and this time the Empress herself appeared, her voice cold and full of authority. "Humans," she began, her tone icy, "you cannot hope to defeat us. You have made your choice. Prepare for the consequences." Alara responded with calm assurance, her voice unwavering. "Empress Veilzinth, we don't seek war, but we will fight for our survival. And we will win." With that, the first salvo of humanity's fleet was unleashed. The Excellanti would soon learn that the Terrans did not just play the game of war, they changed the rules. The moment the first volley of kinetic disruptors was fired, the cold expanse of space erupted into a maelstrom. The supercarriers of humanity's fleet, hidden just beyond the sensors of the Excellanti warships, unleashed a devastating barrage that tore through the void with unrelenting precision. The weapons, designed to strike like the hand of a god, blasted toward their targets at near-relativistic speeds. The Vothzan, flagship of the Excellanti fleet, shuddered as the first shot hit, sending waves of shock through its immense living structure. The psionic shields, which had always been the Excellanti's greatest defense, flickered in a desperate attempt to absorb the blow, but the human weapons cut through them like a knife through tissue, leaving the colossal ship momentarily exposed. On board the Endeavor, Captain Alara Chen stood at the helm, her hands steady despite the storm that raged outside. Her mind was calm, calculating as the battle unfolded in real time. The Excellanti, for all their power and ancient technology, had not understood what they were facing. They thought themselves the apex predators of the galaxy. But humanity had spent a century in the shadows, studying, evolving, and preparing for this moment. The humans were no longer the prey, they were the hunters. "Direct hit," reported Lieutenant Reynolds, his voice calm yet tinged with a hint of awe. "The Vothzan is wounded, but it's still operational. Their shields are regenerating." Alara nodded, her eyes sharp. "We expected that. Their psionics are formidable, but not enough. Not anymore." She turned to Admiral Ortega, who stood beside her, his face unreadable as the battle raged on. "Phase 2, she ordered. "Activate the drones." Thousands of sleek black drones, small and nimble, were deployed from every supercarrier. Each one was a miniature warship in its own right, capable of striking with lightning speed, equipped with quantum disruptors, EMP charges, and short-range kinetic weapons. They spread out across the battlefield, weaving in and out of the Excellanti fleet, attacking from every angle, harrying their enemies and drawing their fire. The drones moved with ruthless efficiency, like a swarm of angry hornets attacking a beast much larger than itself. The Excellanti ships, though massive and powerful, were unaccustomed to such fast, coordinated strikes. Their psionic defenses struggled to keep up, blocking one attack only for another to hit them from the opposite direction. At the same time, the fleet's larger vessels, the supercarriers, remained in the shadows, their stealth fields intact, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Alara's strategy was clear: create chaos, disorient the enemy, and then strike with everything humanity had. The Excellanti were being forced to fight on unfamiliar ground, an unpredictable, unconventional battlefield where every move could be their last. On the bridge of the Vothsan, Empress Veilzinth stood at the center of her command, her three eyes glowing with psionic energy. She'd felt the first strike hit, had sensed the shudder of her flagship as it absorbed the attack. She had expected a challenge, but this was something else entirely. The human fleet was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The psionic signature of their ships was blank, completely invisible to her senses. She could not reach into their minds, could not bend them to her will. It was as if their ships, their crews, were not even alive in the way she understood life. It was unnerving, and it made her hesitate. This should not be happening. Counterattack. The Empress barked, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. She called on the full strength of her fleet, rallying the war beasts, urging them to close the distance and return fire with their full might. The Vothsan unleashed its weapons, a torrent of deadly energy blasts that tore through the darkness toward humanity's ships. The energy rippled through the void, cutting through the swarm of drones, sending sparks and flashes of light across the battlefield. But Alara had anticipated this, and with a single command, the fleet's shields flared to life, blocking the incoming fire. The human fleet's technology had been upgraded for precisely this kind of engagement, resilient and adaptable. The first wave of Excellanti fire was absorbed, and the drones returned to the attack, exploiting every weakness they had seen in the Excellanti ships. On the ground, far below in the depths of humanity's headquarters, the leaders of the unified Terran command watched the battle unfold. The holographic display was filled with data streams, tracking every ship, every weapon, every movement. They had waited for this moment, the moment when humanity would reveal its true strength to the galaxy. And now, as the Excellanti began to falter, as their ships started to break formation and retreat, it was clear that their dominance was slipping. A message was sent from the Endeavor to the Excellanti fleet. This is the beginning. Retreat now or face total annihilation. It was not a threat, it was a statement of fact. The Excellanti had crossed a line, and humanity was now fighting for its future, not just for survival, but for its place in the galaxy. Back in the heart of the battle, the Excellanti fleet began to struggle. Their psionics, once so overwhelming, were faltering against humanity's perfect coordination. The Vothsan fired again, but this time it was too late. A barrage of human quantum torpedoes struck the massive warship. The living ship screamed in agony as it shook, its psionic shields flickering and collapsing. The Empress felt the pain of her flagship in her mind, a terrible, searing sensation. For the first time in centuries, the great Empress Veilzinth felt vulnerable. She knew, in that moment, that her empire's hold over the galaxy was being tested in ways she had never imagined. "Retreat!" she hissed, her voice trembling. The command was sent, but it came too late. The human fleet, acting as one, closed in, cutting off any escape routes. The Vothsan, battered and broken, was surrounded, its psionic power too weak to shield it from the oncoming barrage. The final strike came without mercy, a direct hit to the flagship's central core, rupturing it in a brilliant flash of light. The Vothsan exploded in a violent eruption, its shattered pieces scattering across the battlefield, a fiery testament to humanity's power. The rest of the Excellanti fleet hesitated, their will broken by the sudden, overwhelming force that had just annihilated their leader. The battle was not over, but the tide had already turned. Back aboard the Endeavor, Alara stood tall, her gaze fixed on the fractured remnants of the Excellanti flagship. The fleet had struck a devastating blow, but this was only the first chapter. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Humanity had sent a message, a warning, to the galaxy. They would not be cowed. They would not retreat. And above all, they would never forget the cost of silence. The Excellanti had learned that lesson the hard way.